Yo, what up? So I just want to talk about this quickly because this is probably one of the coolest things that Blizzard has thought of doing recently, and I feel like it's a lot better than a lot of people might initially think it is, because this could actually serve as a very good way to address counter swapping in Overwatch 2. Especially for the tank role in particular, and that is with the new quick play hacked event that's coming that will actually allow you to choose between different role passives for your character. Now, there are some ways that this could ruin the game, other ways that it could help, so I just want to talk about some of the positives I think that it could bring if it's implemented well. Starting with the tanks, I think that it could do a lot in terms of reducing counter swapping, because currently the tank passive has kind of just been really bloated. We have crowd control resistance, we have reduced critical hit damage, we changed how armor works back to the old system that Overwatch 1 had. And these changes are being given to every character in the game, regardless of if they actually needed them or not. Like maybe heroes that do have armor kind of do need the reduced crit damage because of how they changed armor. But heroes that don't have armor certainly didn't really need that, it's just a straight buff to them. Well, now they could just split up all of these different things into their own passives that you could just swap between whenever you wanted to. So let's just say, for instance, that the role passives are reduced knockback and crowd control, maybe even have like a reduced duration for certain negative status effects like anti-nade thrown in there as well. Then you have another passive that's reduced critical hit damage taken, and then you have a third passive that is increased armor that just maybe it gives your tank some armor if they don't have any, and it gives you the Overwatch 1 version of armor that effectively reduces damage from very small damage sources like Tracer or, even shotgun characters, because damage is calculated on a per projectile basis, so each individual pellet is getting its damage cut in half, effectively cutting the entire shotgun's damage in half, and that could be the third passive. So now, instead of having these overloaded tanks that just have everything and just make balancing the game even more difficult, you could just freely swap between these passives whenever you feel like it in order to best address the situation. That way, instead of having to, counter swap your entire character in order to best deal with what the enemy team is doing and, actually try and play the game, you can now just swap your role passive from one passive to another to give yourself a better matchup. Say you're struggling with just getting crowd controlled and knocked around everywhere, then you could use the crowd control reduction passive. Or let's say you're playing against double snipers and you're just getting, headshot into oblivion whenever you drop your barrier or try and do anything. Well, now you can take the crit resistance passive. Could also be a good choice if you're playing against, a Cassidy or just any hit scan character. Let's say the enemy tank swaps to like Mauga or Roadhog, and now you're taking too much damage. Well, now you can swap over to the improved armor passive. Not saying that this is exactly what they're going to do with it, but I think it's a really good idea and a good direction that the game could be taken in order to reduce the frustration of just having to swap off your entire character because they're just getting hard countered. Now you'll at least have a little bit of wiggle room in being able to swap your passive around to try and address what's currently making playing your character so frustrating. For DPS heroes, I feel like it also kind of solves the problem that some characters just don't get benefits from the passive, while other ones get a lot of benefit from it. For instance, sniper characters have basically never gotten any value from the DPS passive really in any of the forms it's been in. They don't really want movement speed after an elimination. Reload speed after an elimination is maybe a little bit good, but other characters are just going to get a lot more out of it, like Tracer, and they also still don't even get that much out of the current DPS passive that applies a healing debuff, because heroes like Tracer or just any character that has a fast fire rate are just going to be able to apply it much easier. So by having multiple DPS passives and letting you choose between them, you can let people pick a passive that's actually going to benefit their character. And presumably all of the passives will be the same for every character within a role. So you'll have 3 DPS passives, and every DPS hero is going to have those same 3 passives. I do think that they could easily expand upon it a little bit in the future by maybe giving each character a character-specific passive that comes at the cost of not being able to get one of the generic ones. That could just do something more silly and impact the game. Such as, I don't know, maybe give Kiriko a double jump, give Genji a triple jump, maybe even a passive that swaps their ability to something else. Like Hanzo could have a passive that replaces Storm Arrow with Scatter Arrow, hero, and now he could have it back, and it could just be an optional thing. Of course, you need to know about this, which is why they could just show what passive a character has on the scoreboard, but I feel like they really should start with just generic passives, and then maybe add in one per character of a more unique passive, because adding a whole bunch of unique passives to every character would just make the game into a nightmare to try and learn what every passive does, so that you know what you're playing against. So the passives should be kept pretty simple and just be, you know, a basic advantage that you could swap between, and there's at least one that your character is going to get value out of. And even adding options just for the DPS passive could make things easier for tank, because there's now no guarantee that the enemy team is going to even be running the healing debuff passive unless they actually need to have it. Such as if you're trying to play it as Roadhog, then they could swap to the passive because you kind of really want that passive against a hero like Roadhog or Mauga. But right now it feels like some tanks are just overly punished by the DPS passive when they don't have the insane amounts of sustain that a hero like Mauga or Roadhog have, that kind of necessitate running that passive. So now you know your DPS could run that passive if, you know, they need it against one of those two tanks, or they could just run another passive, and now you have heroes like Zarya, Queen, Reinhardt, Winston that might not be playing against the DPS passive, and just having this healing debuff be placed on them basically 24/7. So even with just giving options for the DPS passive, it can also make tanks a bit less frustrating to play, because now there's no guarantee that you're just going to have the healing debuff be applied to you all the time. Supports is where I don't even know what they're going to do with them. Like, the support passive right now is already kind of nothing, because now that we have the global healing passive in the game, the support passive is just, now it only takes 2.5 seconds to activate the global healing passive instead of 5 seconds. Which, I mean, sure, it's a little bit faster, but if I manage to avoid taking damage for 2.5 seconds, I'm probably completely safe, and I could just wait for the full 5 seconds, or I could just go grab a health pack instead, or get healed up by my other support. It's not, you know, super beneficial anymore like some of the old versions of the passive were. And because of that, I'm also not really sure what they would ever do with these characters in regards to giving them a passive, because the original intent of the passive was to make it so that supports would have much more uptime in a fight and be able to keep their tank alive now that the tank doesn't have another tank, and basically just be able to stay in the fight much more often and promote much faster gameplay. Because before, even if you took a little bit of chip damage, you would basically have to leave the fight completely to go grab a health pack in order to heal yourself back up. But now you have the option to just play a bit further back and play more safe while still being able to assist your team, and just slowly wait for that health to regenerate. Now that the global healing passive is in the game, I can't really think of any other ways that they would give supports a passive. One idea I thought of that could be interesting was a speed boost whenever you take damage, kind of as an escape tool, so that if you're being pressured, you can just run away a little bit faster. Maybe that could be added to it, but I'm also not sure. That could be very frustrating to play against from a DPS player's perspective, so maybe not. In general, kind of just massive question marks on what they could even have as options for a support passive that wouldn't be super oppressive to play against, or, you know, just frustrating to play against in general. But yeah, in general, I think it's a very cool idea. For tanks, if it's implemented well, it could actually serve as a way to minimize counter swapping by giving you options to tweak your character instead of outright having to swap to a different one. For DPS, it solves the problem of not every DPS benefits the same from whatever version of the DPS passive is in the game at the time. And for supports, I don't know what you do with them. Give Lucio a Desert Eagle. But now onto some of the bad problems that could come with it. And the first pitfall, I think, is that they should not touch any damage values with some of the passives. So a passive that increases damage, I think, would be very bad for the game. One that decreases your own damage for some other benefit, maybe, but increasing it for some cost somewhere else, I think could be really bad for the game, because it would kind of just make that passive really hard meta and, you know, go against this kind of idea that I like about being able to tweak your character in very minor ways based on the situation and what the enemy team comp is, so that they can still be pretty functional even if you are playing against characters that are going to be a counter to your own. Anything that increases damage or drastically increases your damage potential could just become hard meta no matter what downsides they give it, and just lead to the passive system just being incredibly stale and one-dimensional. And it's just like, this one passive is S tier, you're always going to use it, you're never going to use any other passive, all the other ones are bad. You just take the one that helps you deal the most damage. That's the one problem I see with it. Especially if they go with like, oh, the glass cannon passive, where now your character has 200 health, but they deal 10% more damage. I feel like that really just runs the risk of being very frustrating to play against, and also makes the fact that you can normally know what you're up against just by knowing the damage values in the game, and knowing, oh, this hero can 2-tap me, this one cannot, etc. Adding a lot of damage modifiers like that could make the game much harder to really know what you're up against. You could see what passive they're running, but they could also always swap it at any point in time, and unless you check the scoreboard, which I'm assuming is where they would display what passives each player has equipped on their character, then you could easily end up missing it and then just suddenly get 2-tapped by a Cassidy that you did think was able to 2-tap you before. So I think that potentially going for stuff that, you know, impacts damage could be really bad, at least from a competitive standpoint, but even just casually, I think it would just make the game very one-note with what passives you pick. The same could be true for any passives that impact how long your cooldowns are, particularly in making them shorter, because then you could think that a character doesn't have a cooldown ready, when actually they do, because they had the passive that, you know, reduces cooldowns or something. So then you end up making a misplay because you thought they didn't have that ability yet, but they actually did because of the passive. And you just didn't take that into account because maybe they just swapped and you didn't know that they swapped to their passive. But passives that increase your cooldowns, those would maybe be fine. I'm not sure what the other benefit would be, but sure, you could do that because it's not like you're going to misplay because you think a character has a cooldown, but they actually don't. It's just that decreasing the cooldowns could be a problem. For ultimates, at least, I think they could have a passive that slightly increases your ultimate charge rate, just because they don't come up too often. So that could be some way that you're able to add a passive benefit to some character. Like supports could have 10% less healing, but 10% faster ultimate charge rate. I don't know. I'm just really struggling to think of the ways that they could actually implement some other support passives into the game without adding some things that are just really frustrating to play against, or at the very least annoying to the point where people just always complain about it. So yeah, that's it for my yap cess. Kind of annoying that we're not going to get to playtest this until, you know, mid-July, meaning that its actual implementation could be even further away than that, but I still think it's easily the best quick play hack that they've added, assuming that the passives are designed pretty well. I see a lot of potential, but also a lot of potential to make the game much more stale and chaotic, which could be very good from a casual perspective, but not as good from a competitive perspective, where one passive just completely overshadows all of the others, and it could just make the game a bit more one-dimensional. So please like and subscribe if you've gotten this far and feel like it. Next time I'll yap about a hypothetical Orisa rework that could make her more fun to play against, because she's still not fun to play as or to play against, and I'm hoping both of those things could be addressed. So yeah, please like and subscribe if you feel like it again, and see ya. Have a nice week.